Welcome to Canonical. I'm James Shao, and I'm joined by Sam Spieler and Iad Darris.
Hello.
Why is Sam going first? What's with this?
I flip-flop it every once in a while. Technically, I am always first. You guys just fight for second. So today we are kicking off our series on obsession with Vladimir Nabokov's Pale Fire. This is the first book in our series, so let's talk about why we are reading books about obsession. Why are we obsessed with obsession?
I think obsession is interesting because it's always the thing that's in the media, but really unfamiliar to most people. Like, I personally have no obsessions, and unfortunately, I have never been deemed worthy of being obsessed over. Although
Wait, do you have no obsessions?
I would say no. Like, I don't think it's cute when people are like, oh, I'm obsessed with this. Like, that's stupid to me. Like, I don't want to use the word unless it's a real thing. But, have you guys ever been obsessed with things? Like, really obsessed?
I've obsessed mentally about certain things, but I wouldn't stalk people or anything.
For me, an obsession has to go on for quite some time. Of course, there are times when you feel really into something, but if it goes away after a day or two, it's not really obsession.
I was the target of an obsessive student, and it was awkward. She came to my office hours all the time, didn't really have much to say, and there's not much to say about it. I tried to hint at how maybe if she comes to my office hours, she needs to actually talk about something related to class and not just about, nothing, or just to sit there and look at me, which is very strange. I don't think she was stalking me, but she may have been. I don't know. I think obsession in literature is interesting because you have a character who is very extreme, and extreme characters are interesting. You don't want milquetoasty characters.
Yes.
At least not all the time.
I don't think you can get obsession in other kinds of art as well as you can get it through literature. I think a movie about obsession it's going to be very tropey, but I think that
Malkovich?
I think that literature will always do it better. It can show you something in a new way.
We've certainly seen it in books we've already read for this podcast.
So let's talk about what we're doing today. We are reviewing this book, and as with all of our reviews, we won't reveal any spoilers. But I'd say, actually, that there aren't really any spoilers in this book. Maybe there's one big spoiler, but it's so evident from the first third that it's not really a spoiler. What do you guys think? Are there spoilers here?
I don't think so.
Not really.
I don't think that the plot matters so much because it's how the story is told rather than what actually happens.
Yeah. What I'm referring to is obviously King Charles and Kinbote. If you're halfway through his commentary, or at least halfway through the book in terms of pages, you're like, oh, okay. This is him.
Yeah,
so
it's pretty obvious pretty quickly that he's disguising himself in his own writing.
So if you want to join our discussion online, you can find our book club on Reddit by clicking on the link in the episode description. If you want to support us, you can use our bookshop.org link, which is also in the episode description. At the store page, you can find books that we recommend. We are also on social media at Canonical Pod. And next week, we will be having an in-depth discussion of Pale Fire. So we hope you'll join us for that one as well. So this book was my pick for the series, and I went into it without knowing anything about it. Usually I do a little bit of research, but the reason why I felt like I didn't need to do it here was because it was written by Nabokov, and that alone makes it noteworthy. He's one of the most important writers of the 20th century, and having read Lolita, I felt reasonably confident that this book wasn't going to be bad. And then when I was researching the book, I discovered that some critics considered Pale Fire to be one of the best books of the century, which is high praise, And, I'm always wary of these kinds of claims, best books of the century. But after finishing it, I think the praise is definitely warranted because this book is really good. It's a wonderful, wonderful read.
I've read maybe 5 or 6 of Nabokov's novels. I think if you like Lolita, it's obviously his most famous one, but if you like that one, you're definitely going to like this. I think that he has a style, and this is very much him. Like everything that you like about him, at least if you like him, you're going to get it from this novel.
So if you haven't read this book, the book is divided into 4 sections. The poem, Pale Fire, is written in 4 cantos by John Shade, the poet. And the foreword, the commentary, and the index, the other 3 sections, are written by Charles Kinbote, his neighbor and editor of the book. The poem covers themes of death and the supernatural, the death of his daughter, Hazel, the afterlife, or his musings of the afterlife, and his poetry. The parts written by Kinbote talk about Kinbote's relationship to Shade, or his obsession with him, the deposed King Charles's escape from Zembla, which is Kinbote's homeland, and the assassin, I guess we're going to call him Gratus, Gratus's journey to America to kill King Charles. I mentioned before that I thought this novel was wonderful. And the reason why I think it's wonderful is because it engages the reader on multiple levels. The prose is playful and complex, and the narrative invites the reader to unravel the truth behind what is given to the reader via a labyrinthian trail of numbered notes. There are actually multiple ways of reading the novel, and I mean physically reading it. You can read it from front to back, but you can also read it by following all the different footnotes and referring back to the poem and skipping ahead. I mean, you can even, I think, read it by just going down the index and reading all the related parts that are listed in the index. I mean, you really could read it in any number of ways.
You can read it the way I did, where you don't know anything about the book, so you read the poem first.
And you thought it was only a poem.
Yep, without knowing there's a larger story. And then realize it and go back and start again.
Nice.
Yeah, I actually wanted to ask you about that because you mentioned this off air. What did you think about it once you finished the poem? You didn't read the foreword, and I did.
Right.
So if you just read the poem, what did you think? Were you just confused? And did you think, why is this a novel?
No. Well, yeah, I did wonder why it was called a novel and why you picked it. I mean, it's a beautiful poem, but after I started reading the foreword, I kind of slapped my head and thought, well, yeah, it's Nabokov. Why wouldn't it be something more?
What did you get from the poem, having only read the poem? That's what I'm curious about, because I read the foreword before the poem. So, I already have a different kind of approach, I guess, or I viewed it differently already just because I read the foreword.
It's just a poem about death and different aspects of it in his life. It didn't hit me until I was at its end and started reading the foreword that why would you go through the trouble of creating a character who then creates a poem if you're not going to dissect that character in some way? And yeah, it's a good poem without the story, but the story is what actually matters, not the poem.
Well, that seems more authentic, really, because the whole thing about this novel is that it's pretending to be a book of poetry. And for me, in my experience with poetry, I would read the poem first and then read the supplementary material. So what Sam is doing is more authentic to this trick that Nabokov is trying to play. So in one sense, I think it's probably a really good way to read the novel.
It's a way, but it's not a novel. It's not, you know what I mean? It's not the way you read a novel.
Yeah.
Typically, anyway.
I mean, when you talk to us and you're like, hey, this is really short, it's only 990 lines, I'm like, oh man, I'm not going to tell them, but there's more.
Yeah, you were waiting for me to completely fail.
I trust you'd figure it out.
With all these questions
Thanks.
about Kinboat, you'd be really lost.
Who?
I really like the second canto, and I think it's because it's the most narrative of the four, and I'm really not a poet, and I can't say I can even really appreciate poetry on the level of poets. But that second canto I thought was excellent. I love the part about electricity. That was great. I think that was in the second one, and the dual storyline of the Shades waiting at home while their daughter commits suicide. That was really good.
Yeah. You can't have the rest of the poem without having Canto 2.
Yeah. Yeah. I don't know if it's more important than the others, but yes. Yeah.
I kind of think so. I mean, not that the whole poem is about Hazel, but I don't think John Shade writes the poem without Hazel dying.
I'll also add that I think the book is about outcasts, and it makes you feel the pain of these outcasts. Nabokov makes it real for us, but he does it in a very indirect manner. So, for example, Kinboat, if you read him as a real character, is an outcast from his homeland, and you can kind of feel the pain of losing his home. I definitely see that in the book. It's just like in Lolita, where you have a character that you find maybe not despicable in Kinboat's case, but not very likable. But at the same time, you very much feel for him and you understand his pain.
A lot of times you see that pain through the other characters. Because he's so comical, you see Shade acting very kind to him even when he's not around. You know, when he's just within earshot of a conversation Shade is having with someone else. Nabokov points fun at these outcasts quite a bit, even though they're sympathetic. For example, when Kinboat is talking about Hazel, she's relegated to like snippets, even though so much of the poem is about her. He just says, yeah, Hazel was his dead daughter. Anyway, about Zembla.
Yeah. Here's something that's actually important. That's
right. Right.
That's always the way he comments on the poem.
I'm not sure I agree with you too. You're talking about how you feel the pain of these characters. To be honest with you, I didn't feel any pain. Like, these characters exist in a very purposeful kind of shallowness to me. Like, they don't exist with the psychological interiority that you'd expect from a character in a novel. And
even when he's talking about Dissa?
I agree that that's more complex than at other points, but I still don't think it is as true to life or as authentic human experience as I had found in other characters in other novels. But again, it's not a problem to me. I think that this is something that Nabokov is specifically trying to do.
I think there's a layer of falsity in this book because of how he reflects everything back to you or back into each other. Even the title, Pale Fire, is referring to a Shakespearean play, Timon of Athens, right? Where I think it's something like the moon is a pale fire, which is, it's reflecting the light of the sun. That's something I really liked about this book. It's really kind of like a funhouse full of mirrors when you're reading this book. And because of that, it creates this impression that you don't really know what's real. But despite all that, I still feel for the characters. I feel for when Hazel commits suicide. I can feel Kinboat's loneliness. And even if they are not real, like they're figments of some insane person's imagination, if you read it that way, I still feel for them. The only character who's cartoonishly flat is the assassin. Even then, he appears to be real. He's portrayed as this lout who, has diarrhea, and it's so absurd. But you kind of, when reading that, it's given to you from Kinbote's point of view. So you kind of, I think as a reader, feel that this is not totally true, that there is a person underneath this if the story is in fact real.
When I'm reading this novel, there are all of these characters who show up and go away, but Nabokov is on every page. I never forget that this is Nabokov writing, and I never forget that John Shade doesn't exist and Kinbote doesn't exist. These are avatars that Nabokov is using, but the sleight of hand that you have with most narratives is not even attempted in my reading. Like, it was never the point to show us people that could exist or might not exist, or there's no puzzle. Like, a lot of people are trying to figure out what exactly happens in this novel. For me, there's no puzzle at all. Like, it's very clearly false, but false on purpose.
I was actually very invested. Even though it's presented in this very experimental way, I read the characters as real in the process of reading it. I think it wasn't until I finished it and I started thinking about it where, you can think about how this character perhaps wasn't real.
As per usual, I'm somewhere between the both of you. I don't think at any point, at least after I started the foreword, did I take this as a realist text, but I was still invested in it. It did feel like Nabokov was on every page, but that also, that didn't remove me from the story.
Specifically because he uses the structure of a foreword, a poem, commentary, and an index. It elevates it not just from a world inside of a book, but it goes to the entire volume itself is the fiction. And it can turn back on itself a little bit. The only thing that prevents it from fully turning back on itself is that on the cover of the book, it says Vladimir Nabokov instead of Charles Kinbote. So in one sense, yeah, you do have to say, well, this is something that doesn't really exist because Kinbote doesn't exist, but we're writing as if he did exist and he wrote this commentary to this poem. But I think that Vladimir Nabokov is also playing with the idea of how we're encouraged to make all of these misreadings or potential readings. We offer our own ideas about what this novel might mean and how all of these different fictions fit together. And in the end, we're as wrong as Kinbote is when he reads the poem, Pale Fire. Just to be clear here, though, when you guys are talking about investment, what exactly do you mean?
There was never a point for me when I wasn't aware that I was reading this structured thing, this kind of playful, inventive fiction. But at the same time, I cared about what was happening. Even if I was shaking my head at something Kinbote said, I was considering him as a character rather than as a figment of imagination.
Yeah, I mean, the commentary, even though it's labeled as such, I did not read it as commentary. I read it as a character with a very strong voice, but the character is speaking with a purpose. The purpose is to ostensibly give commentary about a poem, but in actuality, give background about his own life, about his life leading up to or during the construction of the poem, his imagined assassin. So I read it as the voice of someone who perhaps is mentally disturbed. I think there's evidence for that for sure, but still the voice of that character. It's just housed under commentary. So it is formally experimental in that way, but if you take out let's say, the numbers, references to the lines. And that's, I mean, that's a big ask because that's the whole point of the commentary. But if you do take it out, you still are left with a narrative. What the references to the lines do is it creates this intratextuality that's very interesting. But that's reading it on a different level. I don't think you have to read it on that level. I think you can read it on multiple levels.
Yeah, I suppose that's true. Like you could skip that, but it just asks the question to me, like, if you are skipping that, what's the point? Like, that to me is the main attraction. That level of it being a commentary, but not really a commentary. Like, that's the thing. That's what you're here for, or that's what I'm here for, at least.
I see it as, yes, like the form is very interesting, and the form is one of the defining features. But aside from that, the narrative also is interesting. And the narrative, it's compelling because it's interesting on a different level. It's not just intellectual, it's intellectual and emotional. And if you look at the criticism that's arisen around this book, other people are also responding to it on that level as well. So I don't think that there's nothing there. I think there is something there. But it's not, the main thrust, perhaps, because of how obvious it is in its formation, but it's still there. I'm not disagreeing with you in that I don't see what you're saying. I'm just saying that for me, there are multiple ways of enjoying this book.
Here I want to go back to something that I had talked about when we read A Confederacy of Dunces. I think I stood alone at that point in saying that it might have been better as a sitcom. And I had this idea that a work of art should be in the form that suits it best. Here I want to point to this novel specifically as saying that this is the kind of story, this is the kind of work of art that belongs in literature. Like, this is literature at its purest form. And this is the kind of artistic achievement that cannot be replicated elsewhere. So I think that for me, just it orientates my reading. I don't want to say, again, that you're wrong, James, because I don't think that you're wrong. But for me, this other achievement, because it is so singular and it is so unique, it really overwhelms other things. And maybe it doesn't overwhelm it for other people, but for me, like, that's the thing that I think is really what makes this novel worth reading to me.
I disagree with your premise, as we discussed with A Confederacy of Dunces, but I do think you're right here. I don't see how you could do this justice in any other form. You could certainly have a movie that had the broad strokes of the story and that conveyed the falsities and the tricks here and there. And certainly movies have done that. But you would miss the nuance that is happening here. You would miss the language, which is a big part of Nabokov. But you would also miss the odd intertextuality that James mentioned. I think if you were to turn this into a movie or something similar, especially something visual, it would really drop away most of what makes this important.
Just to highlight what you said, Sam, the language is really excellent.
Yes.
I mean, if you just even toss out the form entirely and just read it for the language, I still think it's worth your while. Like, you just pick any, let's say, smattering of 10 pages. If you're someone who appreciates writing, you would appreciate this.
Yeah, from just the sentences themselves to the playfulness of John Shade creating words or Kinboat not getting something that Shade has written. The poem is very good, really is a beautiful poem, but then all the commentary around it ranges from funny to endearing to ridiculous. And there's a big difference between what Shade says and how he says it and what and how Kinboat writes. Very different voices. And yeah, the language is definitely one of the best things about this book.
I'm sure people have said this ad nauseum, but Nabokov has this really rare ability to create tension within sentences. And he does it so well. He just manages to layer words and smash them together and just be very creative with his vocabulary in a way that very few authors can be. I think English was not his first language, but I've read some articles about him that talk about how he actually wrote in English before he wrote in Russian. So I don't really know, like, if we would consider him to be a second language learner of English, but man, his English is probably better than almost everyone who's ever lived.
Yeah.
It is so good.
You never get the sense that he's playing safe. You always get the feeling, I think, when you read Nabokov, that he's always trying to hit a home run. He's always going to include the complicated structure, the compound sentence, the neologism. He's always going to go for it. And it's almost always successful.
All right, let's take a break. When we come back, we'll talk about how this compares to other books we've read for the podcast. We'll be right back. Welcome back. So we've read a lot of books that we really liked for this podcast. Where do you think this ranks on that list?
I think this is the best book we've read. I don't think it's my favorite book. I think this still comes in second in my personal taste to Tawada, but that's just personal taste. I think this is overall a better book and a more important book. It takes more effort than Tawada.
I think I agree with you, Sam. This is the kind of book that it's wonderful and enjoyable in its own right, but its significance is such that you have to give it bonus points just because you can see how this changed the game for modern literature. You can see how this raised the stakes, like with Tawada, she is in a climate that's already receptive to her kind of genre-bending lyrical inventiveness. But with Nabokov, I really feel like this changed the rules of fiction.
Yeah, I felt similarly. And I think that this was one of the few books that we've read where upon finishing, I wanted to actually read it again, like right from the start, just because I felt like I missed parts. Like I missed understanding parts of the book. Having finished it, I wanted to go right back to it. And I also am very curious about how the reading experience would change if I had read it differently. Like you, Sam, if I just skipped around or read the poem first, or if I, some people recommend reading it by following the footnotes in the commentary. Just when he said, go to this line, go to that line, or go to that comment. I'm actually really curious about how that affects my experience of reading the book.
Yeah. And speaking of which, I would not recommend reading an ebook version, which is what I have. I think a regular paper-bound version will be so much easier with all the notes. If you're trying to use the commentary as commentary, that would really help you move back and forth between pages.
This is something you mentioned earlier, and I didn't chime in, but I will here. This is really funny. Like at the beginning in the foreword where, it reads like a normal foreword and then suddenly he starts complaining about an amusement park across the street. And when I read that, I was like, wait, what the fuck? Like, because I didn't know it was going to be this kind of text. So I thought it was just a foreword. And I was like, oh, who's this guy complaining about an amusement park? So yeah, there are just moments that are really funny. Like he feels people are always putting him down. So I forget if it was the dean of his school or someone who sent out a memo saying, this guy's obviously insane, referring to Kinboat. So yeah, there are moments like that are really funny.
Let's think about this novel's legacy, because this was published, I think, 60 years ago, 59 years ago. How does it feel nowadays? Is it still fresh? Because it was very inventive, but do we still feel the same way?
Well, I don't see a lot of texts like this. This does it so well that I can't imagine anything completely supplanting it without nodding back to it.
If you want to get at everything in the novel and unpack everything that's happening in the novel, do you need to have some sort of theoretical apparatus? Like, what should you be thinking about when you're reading this novel in order to unpack that? Because you can still see everything there and then decide for yourself what's important and what's not important. For me, I would say you need to have some sort of academic focus. Like, you need to be concerned with the novel as a novel. You need to have that kind of postmodern understanding.
Yeah, I guess that's true. And in that way, I wouldn't recommend it to everyone, because there are people that either won't get it or won't want to put in the effort. But I don't think the people that want to read this, I don't think they need to go into it expecting a certain structure, or I don't think it has to be read as anything other than a novel at first pass.
It's so strange. It really is strange. I think that people who expect a traditional novel might be turned off, especially when you have to read this poem. I mean, there are people who just don't want to read poems. So I think you have to be inclined to experiment as a reader in order to really fully appreciate this poem. Because if you don't want to read poetry, then you might just end up skipping ahead, right? I don't know if one needs to have academic training, but I think you have to be inclined toward reading experimental literature, and those people tend to be academically trained.
Yeah.
At least more patient. Yeah, there's a patience that you need to have to put up with the odd narration that Kinboat is giving.
I do think you have to be a little bit older. This is not the kind of novel that I think a teenager could appreciate. I think that there is a mature sensibility. I think that it is a very erudite sensibility that it requires a little bit of life experience to come to. I can't point to anything specifically in the novel, but it's not flashy. Like, it's difficult to explain its appeal. Like, the language is wonderful, of course, but in terms of like what the book is actually about, it's very difficult to understand how it's enjoyable. And I think as a younger reader, I might not have understood.
And there is that underlying mystery of what is actually happening in the book. And I don't know if I find that so appealing, but a ton of academics do.
Yeah.
A ton of academics have written a lot of papers about what is actually happening in this book. So I think there's that appeal, that kind of unraveling, solving a mystery appeal of this book. All right, let's stop here. Thank you for listening to our review of Pale Fire. If you would like to let us know what you thought about this book, if you also enjoyed it or didn't enjoy it, we are on Reddit, so come find us using that link below. We are also on social media at Canonical Pod, and you can use our link to support us in your local bookstore. That's the bookshop.org link in our episode description. Next week, we'll have an in-depth discussion of Pale Fire. If you're interested in that, go ahead and find a copy of the book and subscribe to us so you can get that episode notification when it gets released next Friday. Till next time, happy reading. We'll talk to you soon.